I stood in the empty parking lot, my silver heels clicking against the asphalt as I watched the last car pull away. The prom venue's lights dimmed behind me, and my phone showed 2:47 a.m. Dad's number sat at the top of my call log, 15 unanswered attempts. I smiled, slipped the phone back into my clutch, and ordered my own Uber. This time, I wasn't crying. This time, I knew exactly what was coming. In my first life, I had waited in this exact spot until 4 a.m., mascara streaking my face, my carefully curled hair wilting in the humid night air. I had called Dad over and over, voice breaking with each voicemail, until finally, a police officer doing rounds found me and drove me home. When I walked through the door at dawn, still in my dress, Dad was passed out on the couch with an empty bottle of scotch, and my stepsister Melissa was eating cereal at the kitchen counter, smirking at me over her Lucky Charms. "Rough night?" she'd asked, and I had crumbled. But that was 17 years ago, or rather, it would be 17 years from now. The cosmic joke of my situation still felt surreal even 6 months into this second chance. I had died at 35, alone in a studio apartment, estranged from everyone who should have loved me, after years of failed relationships and a career that never quite launched. The last thing I remembered was the bitter taste of sleeping pills and the thought that no one would even notice I was gone for weeks. Then I woke up the morning of my 16th birthday, gasping in my childhood bedroom with its faded purple walls and posters of bands I'd pretended to like because Melissa liked them first. The Uber arrived, a clean Honda driven by a kind woman named Patricia, who asked if I'd had a good time. The best, I told her, and meant it. Because this time, I hadn't wasted the evening hoping Dad would show up to take the father-daughter photos he'd promised. This time, I danced every dance, laughed with friends I'd later lose touch with, and when my date tried to pressure me into leaving early for a hotel room, I'd shut him down with confidence I never had at 16 before. This time, I knew my worth. The house was dark when Patricia dropped me off, but I could see the living room TV flickering through the curtains. Same scene as before. I let myself in quietly and found Dad exactly where I remembered, sprawled on the couch, mouth open, snoring, the bottle rolled under the coffee table. The kitchen light was on. Melissa was probably still awake, probably still waiting to watch me break down. I walked straight past the kitchen, ignoring her presence, and went upstairs to my room. I heard her chair scrape. She was following, couldn't resist. "Well, well," Melissa's voice dripped with false sweetness as she leaned against my doorframe. "Did Daddy forget his precious princess?" I turned to face her, taking in her appearance with new eyes. At 20, Melissa was objectively beautiful. Dad's money had paid for everything from braces to dermatologist visits that I'd been denied. Her blonde hair was professionally highlighted, her skin clear, her clothes designer. In my first life, I had envied her so desperately, it poisoned me from the inside. Now, I just saw a spoiled, cruel girl who peaked in college and would spend the next decade watching her looks fade while making terrible relationship choices. I knew her future because I'd seen it before I died. Her third divorce, the pyramid scheme disaster, the estrangement from her own daughter. "He did," I said simply, starting to remove my jewelry. "But that's okay. I got myself home." She blinked, clearly thrown by my lack of tears. "That's it? You're not going to cry about it? Not going to wake him up and scream?" "Why would I?" I met her eyes steadily. "He's shown me who he is. I believe him." "You're so weird," she muttered, but I could see uncertainty crossing her face. In the original timeline, she'd fed off my pain for years, used my desperate need for Dad's approval as ammunition. Without that vulnerability to exploit, she didn't quite know what to do with me. I closed the door in her face and locked it. A new addition I'd installed myself with tools bought with babysitting money. In my first life, I never had boundaries. In this one, I was building fortresses. The next morning, Dad knocked on my door around noon, hungover and apologetic. I recognized this scene too. In the original timeline, he'd given me a rambling excuse about a client emergency and promised to make it up to me, a promise he never kept. I'd accepted it because I was so starved for his attention that even his excuses felt like love. "Sweetheart, can we talk?" His voice was rough with regret, but I heard the practiced quality to it. This was a man who'd spent years apologizing without ever changing. I opened the door, dressed in jeans and a hoodie, my prom dress already packed away. Sure, Dad. He launched into the same script I remembered about the conference call that ran late, about losing track of time, about how special I was to him. I watched his face with detachment, noting the broken capillaries around his nose, the way his hands trembled slightly. Signs of the alcoholism that would kill him in 8 years, leaving everything to Melissa in a will he'd changed without telling me. It's fine, I said when he finally wound down. Really? I'll make it up to you, he promised. What do you say we go to that fancy restaurant you like? Just you and me, father-daughter time? In my first life, I had lit up at this suggestion, so desperate for his attention that I'd clung to the promise for weeks while he repeatedly canceled. This time, I smiled politely. Sure, Dad, let me know when. I knew he'd never follow through. He'd make plans and break them, always with another excuse, another emergency. But I didn't need his restaurants anymore. I had something he didn't know about, something that made all his broken promises irrelevant. Because when I died and woke up 16 again, I didn't just come back with memories. I came back with knowledge, specific, valuable knowledge about the next 17 years. I knew which stocks would soar and which companies would crash. I knew about Bitcoin when it was still trading for dollars. I knew which real estate markets would explode and which startups would become giants. In my first life, I'd struggled through community college while Dad paid for Melissa's private university. I'd worked retail jobs and lived paycheck to paycheck, always one emergency away from disaster. I'd never learned to advocate for myself, never built the confidence to demand better. This time would be different. Over the next few weeks, I put my plan into motion. I'd been babysitting and tutoring since my 16th birthday 6 months ago, socking away every dollar. I'd opened a bank account Dad knew nothing about, and I'd been carefully researching investment platforms that would let a minor trade with a custodial account. The trick was finding an adult who would co-sign without asking too many questions or trying to control the money. That's where Mrs. Patricia Chen came in. I'd remembered her from my first life, my high school economics teacher who'd seen potential in me that I'd never lived up to. In the original timeline, she'd tried to mentor me, encouraged me to apply for scholarships, but I'd been too beaten down by my home life to believe I could succeed at anything. We'd lost touch after graduation. This time, I'd cultivated a relationship with her from the start of junior year. I'd joined the investment club she ran, asked thoughtful questions, stayed after class to discuss economic theory. I'd positioned myself as a promising student interested in business, which wasn't a lie. I was obsessed with undoing the financial catastrophe my first life had been. Mrs. Chen, I approached her desk one afternoon in early June. Can I ask you something about custodial investment accounts? She looked up from grading papers, her sharp eyes curious behind wire-rimmed glasses. Of course, Sophia, what's on your mind? I've been saving money from babysitting and tutoring, I explained, sticking close to the truth. I want to start investing, but I'm not 18 yet. I did some research, and there are custodial accounts that would let me trade if I have an adult co-account holder. The thing is, I hesitated, letting vulnerability show through, calculated but not entirely false. My dad isn't really involved in my life that way, and I don't want to ask him because he'd probably just tell Melissa and she'd find some way to ruin it. Mrs. Chen's expression softened. She'd taught Melissa too 2 years ago, and while she'd never say anything unprofessional, I could see she understood exactly what kind of person my stepsister was. How much have you saved? She asked, carefully. About $4,000, the number made by Baez. Her eyebrows rise. I've been working a lot, and I live very cheaply. That's impressive, Sophia. She set down her red pen. What kind of investments are you considering? This was the crucial moment. I couldn't reveal I had knowledge of the future, but I could demonstrate research and reasoning that would make her trust my judgment. I've been studying emerging tech companies, I said, pulling out a folder I'd prepared. There's this company called Tesla. They make electric cars. Everyone thinks they're going to fail, but I've analyzed their technology and their CEO's track record. I think they're undervalued. It was 2007. Tesla was trading at $4 a share, and most analysts thought it was a joke. In my first life, I'd never paid attention to the stock market. In this life, I knew Tesla would eventually hit over $400 per share before splits. Mrs. Chen flipped through my analysis, pages of research I'd carefully crafted to look like the work of a precocious teenager rather than someone with future knowledge. I'd included other companies too, a mix of eventual winners and reasonable picks that wouldn't pan out, so I wouldn't seem impossibly prescient. "This is very thorough work," she said finally. "I'm impressed by your research methodology." But Sophia, investing always carries risk. Even with research, you could lose money. "I know, no," I said earnestly. "But I've been reading everything I can find about investment strategy, and I understand about diversification and risk tolerance. This money, it's my ticket out. My ticket to college, to independence, to a life that's mine. Dad isn't going to help me. I have to help myself." The truth in those words resonated. Mrs. Chen studied my face for a long moment, and I saw the decision forming. "All right," she said slowly. "I'll co-sign on a custodial account, but with conditions. You'll only invest money you can afford to lose completely. You'll maintain a separate savings account with at least 6 months of expenses. And you'll meet with me monthly to discuss your strategy. This is educational. I'm helping you learn, not just giving you free rein." "Yes," I agreed immediately. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. You have no idea what this means to me." If she only knew. In my first life, I died with $127 in my checking account and $45,000 in debt. In this life, I was going to build an empire. We opened the account the following week. I started with a conservative allocation, mostly index funds with small positions in the companies I knew would explode. I didn't want to seem too lucky too fast. Tesla, Amazon, Apple. I bought Bitcoin in 2009 when it was $0.10. Though I had to explain to Mrs. Chen what cryptocurrency even was, framing it as a risky experimental position that was only 5% of my portfolio. But investing was just part of the plan. The other part was cutting my father out of my life completely before he could do more damage. Dad's calls after prom night followed the pattern I remembered. First came apologies, then promises, then silence as he got busy with work and Melissa's needs. In my first life, each unanswered text had felt like abandonment. This time, I welcomed his absence. I was documenting everything. Every broken promise, every missed birthday, every parent-teacher conference he skipped while attending all of Melissa's college events. I kept a detailed journal, backed up digitally with dates and specifics. Because I knew what was coming in 8 years, his death and the will that left everything to Melissa with a single line about me. I leave my daughter Sophia $5,000 as she has always been independent and asked little of me. In my first life, that will had devastated me. It was the final proof that I'd never mattered to him, that all my desperate attempts to win his love had been futile. I'd contested it half-heartedly, but Melissa had the money for better lawyers, and I'd given up. This time, I was building a case for undue influence and mental incapacity during the will's creation. But more than that, I was building a life where his money wouldn't matter at all. Senior year passed in a blur of strategic decisions. I applied to colleges Dad knew nothing about, targeting schools with full scholarships for students with my grades and test scores, which were much better this time around since I already knew all the material. I didn't waste time on friends who'd drift away or boys who'd break my heart. I worked, saved, invested, and watched my portfolio grow. By graduation, my initial $4,000 had become $15,000, thanks to some aggressive but informed plays on tech stocks during a market dip. Mrs. Chen was stunned by my returns, and I carefully played it as a mix of research, intuition, and luck. She wrote me a glowing recommendation letter for college scholarships. Dad showed up to graduation, of course. He always showed up for the big public events where his absence would be noticed. He sat next to Melissa, who'd just finished her sophomore year at Yale, and they whispered to each other during the ceremony while I gave the salutatorian speech. I deliberately aimed for second place instead of valedictorian to avoid the time commitment that would interfere with my work schedule. After the ceremony, Dad tried to hug me. "So proud of you, sweetheart. You've always been so independent." That word, independent. In my first life, I'd eventually realized it was his code for neglected. He was proud that I needed so little from him because it absolved him of guilt for giving me nothing. "Thanks, Dad," I said, extracting myself from his embrace. I should go. I have a shift at the restaurant tonight. On graduation night? He frowned, the concerned father act sliding into place. Sophia, you should be celebrating. I am celebrating, I said. I'm celebrating paying for college myself. Melissa snorted. So dramatic. Dad would help if you just asked. I looked at her directly. Really? Is that why he told me he couldn't afford to help with my applications, but he's covering your summer trip to Europe? Dad's face flushed. That's different. Melissa needs... It's fine, Dad, I cut him off. I stopped expecting things from you a long time ago. I walked away, leaving them standing there. I heard Melissa say something sharp, heard Dad's defensive response, but I didn't look back. That conversation had felt good. Not explosive or dramatic like it would have been in my first life, just clear and factual. I had transcended the need for his approval. The summer before college, I worked 3 jobs and watched my portfolio like a hawk. Mrs. Chen and I had lunch once a month to review my investments, and I could see her amazement growing. The custodial account was nearing $50,000 by August, thanks to some particularly good timing on tech stocks and my Bitcoin position starting to move. Sophia, she said over iced tea at a cafe near her house. I have to ask, where is this knowledge coming from? Some of these picks, Tesla, Amazon, this Bitcoin thing, they're incredibly prescient. You're making returns that professional fund managers would envy. I'd prepared for this question. Honestly, Mrs. Chen, I think it's because I have nothing to lose. The analysts and fund managers, they have reputations to protect, bosses to answer to. They can't take chances on weird stuff like electric cars or digital currency. But me? I can afford to be wrong. And I do research constantly. I read everything, annual reports, tech blogs, patent filings. I look for companies solving real problems in innovative ways. It wasn't entirely a lie. That's exactly what the best investors did. I just happened to know which innovations would actually succeed. She smiled, shaking her head. You're going to do remarkable things, you know that? I hope so, I said. I'm going to try. I left for college in September with my portfolio transferred to an individual account I could control when I turned 18, just 2 months away. I'd been accepted to a state school with a full ride scholarship, and I'd chosen to live off campus in a cheap apartment rather than in dorms. This raised eyebrows from the financial aid office, but I explained that I had a medical condition that required privacy. It was vague enough to shut down questions without being a complete lie. The medical condition was PTSD from my first life's trauma, though I didn't phrase it that way. The real reason was that I needed space to manage my investments without a nosy roommate asking questions, and I needed to be ready to scale up my operations the moment I turned 18. Dad called twice in the first month of college, once to ask if I needed anything, once to tell me Melissa had gotten into a prestigious sorority. I kept the conversations brief and polite. I was busy building my future, and he was rapidly becoming irrelevant to it. On my 18th birthday, I logged into my investment account with trembling hands, $75,000. In barely 2 years, I'd turned $4,000 into $75,000. But that was just the beginning. I'd been waiting for this moment because I knew exactly what was coming. In December 2008, the market was going to crash. The Great Recession. Housing bubble, financial crisis, panic. I'd lived through it once as an oblivious teenager who didn't understand why adults suddenly seemed so scared. This time, I was going to profit from the chaos. I spent October and November liquidating most of my positions, moving money into cash and short positions on banks and financial institutions I knew were about to collapse. Mrs. Chen called me, concerned. Sophia, this is very aggressive. You're betting against the entire market. I know, I said. But look at the housing data, the mortgage-backed securities, the derivative exposure. Mrs. Chen, the fundamentals are screaming that something's wrong. This feels like 1929. You're 18 years old, she said, not unkindly. How would you know what 1929 felt like? I wanted to say. Because I lived through 2008 once already. and watched people lose everything. Instead, I said, I've been reading everything I can find about historical market crashes, and my gut is telling me something bad is coming. She was quiet for a moment. What percentage of your portfolio are you moving to this position? 60%? The rest stays in cash and defensive positions. And if you're wrong, then I lose a lot of money and learn a very expensive lesson. But Mrs. Chen, I really don't think I'm wrong. She sighed. You're an adult now. It's your money, your decision. But please be careful. I was more than careful. I was certain. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in September, when the market went into freefall, my short positions printed money. By December, my portfolio had ballooned to $200,000. I was 19 years old and a quarter millionaire, and nobody in my family knew. I bought back into the market in March 2009 when everyone else was panicking. I knew the recovery was coming. I knew which companies would soar. And I bought with both hands: Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Tesla again at rock bottom prices. Mrs. Chen stopped questioning my instincts after that. College was easy. I'd already learned this material once. I spent my time working on a business plan, studying advanced investment strategies, and occasionally attending classes. I made no close friends by design. Friendships required emotional investment I wasn't ready to make, and most of them would dissolve anyway after graduation. Instead, I networked strategically, building relationships with professors and local business owners who might prove useful. Dad's calls became less frequent. He'd phone on holidays, always sounding slightly drunk, always saying he missed me and we should get together soon. We never did. I was relieved. Every conversation with him reminded me of how much energy I'd wasted in my first life trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it. Melissa's calls were worse. She started contacting me junior year, suddenly interested in having a relationship now that her college friends were drifting away and her boyfriend had dumped her. I saw through it immediately. She was lonely and wanted an audience for her problems. In my first life, I would have been so grateful for her attention that I'd have let her use me as an emotional dumping ground. Hey, Soph, she said on one call, her voice falsely bright. I was thinking maybe we could meet up over winter break, like sister bonding time. I'm not coming home for winter break, I said, working on my laptop while we talked. My portfolio had just passed $500,000, and I was researching commercial real estate opportunities. I have work. Work? What kind of work? Dad said you're doing some kind of business thing? Of course, Dad had noticed the change in me, the growing confidence, the fact that I'd stopped asking him for anything at all. He'd made casual inquiries about my life during our rare phone calls, probably feeling some belated guilt. Investment consulting, I said vaguely. It wasn't entirely false. I'd started advising a few local small business owners on financial strategy, charging modest fees while building a reputation. That sounds weird. Soph, are you okay? You've been so distant since high school. The false concern in her voice was almost funny. This was the same person who'd laughed at my tears, stolen my things, and made my childhood a battlefield. I'm great, actually, I said. Better than I've ever been. It's just, Dad's worried about you. He says you've changed. I have changed, I agreed. I grew up. There was a pause. Are you mad at us or something? The question was so absurd I almost laughed. Mad? I was beyond mad. I had transcended anger and reached a place of cool, strategic detachment. They couldn't hurt me anymore because I'd stopped giving them power over my emotions. No, Melissa, I'm just busy building my own life. You should try it sometime. I hung up before she could respond. She didn't call back. By the time I graduated college in 2012, my portfolio was worth $2.3 million. I'd ridden the post-recession recovery perfectly, and my Bitcoin position, which I'd been steadily accumulating, was starting to gain mainstream attention. I'd bought thousands of coins when they were cheap, and now they were worth hundreds of dollars each. I didn't attend my college graduation ceremony. There was no one I wanted there, and I had more important things to do. Instead, I spent that weekend in New York City meeting with a real estate broker about a portfolio of properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods. I knew which areas would gentrify, which buildings would triple in value. I bought 3 brownstones in Brooklyn for cash, planning to renovate and rent them out. Dad left a voicemail saying he was disappointed I'd skipped graduation. Deleted it without listening to the whole thing. The next phase of my plan required patience. I knew Dad's alcoholism would catch up with him in 2015. Liver failure. Sudden and not entirely unexpected to anyone who'd been paying attention to his drinking. He'd die in the hospital with Melissa by his side, having spent the previous few months getting his affairs in order under her influence. In my first life, I hadn't known he was sick until after he died. He'd kept it from me, or maybe just hadn't bothered to call. When Melissa finally contacted me to tell me about the funeral, she'd already had the will read. Everything went to her with that pathetic $5,000 token for me and a note about my independence. This time would be different because I was documenting everything. I hired a private investigator in 2013, a discreet professional who'd come recommended by one of my business contacts. I need surveillance on my father, I told her. I need to know who he's meeting with, what lawyers he's consulting, any changes to his health status, and I need documentation of his alcohol consumption and any signs of cognitive decline. The investigator, a sharp woman in her 50s named Rebecca, raised an eyebrow. That's quite a comprehensive request. May I ask why? Estate planning concerns, I said evenly. I have reason to believe my stepsister is manipulating him, and I want to protect his interests and mine. It was expensive, but I could afford it. My portfolio had passed $4 million. My real estate investments were generating steady income, and I'd started a small venture capital fund that invested in startups I knew would succeed. I was 24 years old and richer than Dad had ever been, though he didn't know it. Rebecca's reports painted a grim picture. Dad's drinking had accelerated. He was missing work frequently, showing up to meetings confused, repeating himself. Melissa had moved back in with him after her second failed relationship, and she was accompanying him to all his lawyer appointments. In March 2015, Rebecca called me directly. Your father was diagnosed with cirrhosis last month. Advanced stage. The doctors have given him 6 months to a year. I felt nothing. In my first life, this news would have destroyed me, grief compounded by guilt over our estrangement. This time, I just saw the chess pieces moving into position. And Melissa? She's been very involved in his care, Rebecca said carefully. Perhaps too involved. I have footage of her in his home office going through files. She's been meeting with estate lawyers without him present. Keep documenting everything, I instructed. I want a complete record. Dad called me a few days later. I almost didn't answer. I'd been avoiding his calls for years now, but I knew this was the moment where he'd try to reconnect, where he'd want to clear his conscience before dying. Sophia? His voice was weak, slurred. Sweetheart, it's Dad. I know, and I said, what do you want? The coldness in my tone seemed to shock him. There was a long pause. I wanted to tell you something. I'm sick, honey. It's my liver. The doctors say I don't have much time. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, meaning it in an abstract way. I was sorry that anyone had to die of liver failure. It was a painful death. But I wasn't sorry for him specifically. I know we haven't been close, he continued, and I could hear him crying softly. I know I wasn't the father you deserved. I was so focused on work, and after your mom died, I didn't know how to raise a daughter alone. And then when I married Melissa's mom, I thought we'd be a family, but you chose Melissa, I finished flatly. Every time, every birthday, every school event, every moment that mattered, you chose her. That's not fair. It's completely fair, Dad. It's just true, but it's fine. I stopped needing you a long time ago. Sophia, please. I want to make things right before I go. Can we meet? Can we talk? This was the moment. In my first life, I'd never gotten this call. He'd kept his illness secret and died with our estrangement unresolved, leaving me with guilt and unanswered questions. This time, he was reaching out, and I had a choice. I could forgive him. I could go to him, have some tearful reconciliation, be there when he died. It's what a good daughter would do. It's what the protagonist of a redemption story would do, but I wasn't trying to be good. I was trying to be whole. And I knew from years of therapy in my first life, therapy I'd needed because of the damage he'd done, that forgiveness isn't mandatory. Some hurts are too deep, and some people don't deserve absolution just because they're dying. No, I said simply, I don't think we should meet. Sophia, you made your choices, Dad. For years and years, you made choices that showed me I didn't matter to you. You forgot to pick me up from prom. You missed every important moment in my life. You gave Melissa everything and gave me nothing but criticism and neglect. You don't get to ask for forgiveness now just because you're scared of dying. I'm your father. Biologically, yes, but that's all. You were never a parent to me, not in any way that mattered, and now you want me to absolve you of guilt so you can die in peace? No, you don't get that from me. He was sobbing now, ugly choking sounds. Please, sweetheart, please don't leave it like this. You left it like this, I said quietly. You left it like this every time you chose alcohol over me, every time you chose Melissa over me, every time you made a promise to me and broke it. I'm just honoring the relationship we actually had, not the one you wish we'd had. I hung up. My hands were steady. I felt calm, clear, resolved. He called 14 more times over the next week. I never answered. He left voicemails, some angry, some pleading, some drunk and incoherent. I saved them all, added them to the documentation. They were proof of his mental state, his alcoholism, his instability. Melissa called too, furious. What is wrong with you? Dad is dying and you won't even talk to him? That's between me and Dad, I said. Yes. You're so selfish. You've always been selfish. He's in the hospital asking for you, crying for you, and you won't even visit? Did you ever think, I said coldly, about why he might need to cry, about what he might need forgiveness for, or are you still pretending we all had one big happy family? You're ungrateful. Goodbye, Melissa. I blocked her number. I blocked Dad's number. I let Rebecca continue her surveillance, and I waited. Dad died in June 2015 in a hospital room with Melissa holding his hand. I know because Rebecca was there, discreetly photographing and recording. Melissa had banned me from his room, not that I was trying to visit, and she made sure everyone knew I'd abandoned my dying father. I didn't go to the funeral. I sent flowers with a card that said simply, "Rest in peace." It was more than he deserved, but I did it for appearances. The will reading was exactly what I expected. Melissa inherited everything: the house, the investment accounts, his business interests, his life insurance policy. Everything except that one insulting line about me and my independence with a $5,000 bequest. The lawyer handling the estate called me to schedule a meeting. Ms. Chen, I need to review your father's will with you and arrange transfer of your bequest. I'd like to contest the will, I said. There was a pause. On what grounds? Undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. My father was severely alcoholic with documented cognitive decline at the time the will was written. My stepsister isolated him from me, manipulated him while he was mentally compromised, and structured his estate entirely to her benefit. I have extensive documentation. Another pause, longer this time. Ms. Chen, will contests are expensive and difficult to win. I have resources, I said, and I have evidence. I've been documenting my father's deterioration and my stepsister's actions for 2 years. I have medical records, surveillance footage, expert testimony ready to go. I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing this for justice. The lawyer sighed. I'll need to see your documentation. I sent him everything. Hundreds of pages of reports, photos, videos, medical records I'd obtained through proper legal channels. Testimony from Rebecca, statements from Dad's colleagues about his drinking and confusion. Phone records showing Melissa's constant contact with estate lawyers while Dad was hospitalized. Financial records showing suspicious transfers of assets to Melissa in the months before Dad's death. And crucially, my journal. Years of documented broken promises, missed events, blatant favoritism. A record of systematic emotional neglect that established why Dad might have felt guilty, enough to leave me money, and why Melissa might have worked to eliminate that guilt and my inheritance. The case went to mediation first. Melissa showed up with an expensive lawyer, confident and angry. She'd put on weight since I'd last seen her, and there was a hardness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She looked at me with pure hatred. "You're disgusting," she hissed before the mediation started. "He's barely in the ground, and you're circling like a vulture." "I'm establishing the truth," I said calmly. "Something you've never been interested in." Her lawyer tried to dismiss my claims immediately, calling them a transparent money grab from an estranged daughter. But when my lawyer presented our evidence, particularly the surveillance footage of Melissa manipulating Dad while he was clearly intoxicated and confused, the mediator's expression changed. "Ms. Davis," the mediator said to Melissa, "I'm seeing some concerning patterns here. Can you explain these meetings with estate attorneys that your father wasn't present for?" "I was looking out for his interests," Melissa said defensively. "Someone had to since Sophia abandoned him." "The documentation suggests you were looking out for your own interest," my lawyer interjected smoothly. "You arranged for your father to disinherit his daughter while he was cognitively impaired and emotionally vulnerable. That's textbook undue influence." We went back and forth for hours. Melissa's lawyer tried to paint me as the villain, but my documentation was too comprehensive. The mediator finally suggested a settlement. I'd receive 40% of the estate, Melissa would keep 60%. "No," I said. Everyone looked at me in surprise. "No," the mediator repeated. "I want 50-50, and I want the house. And I want Melissa to sign a statement acknowledging that our father's final will was created under her undue influence while he was mentally incapacitated." Melissa exploded. "That's insane. I'm not signing anything like that." "Then we'll go to trial," I said serenely, "and all of this evidence will become public record. Your colleagues will know, your friends will see it in court filings, everyone will learn exactly how you manipulated a sick, dying man to steal his daughter's inheritance. Or you can settle now, sign the statement, and we can both move on." Her face went red, then white. I could see her calculating, weighing her options. The estate was worth about $3.2 million. Respectable, but not extraordinary. Split evenly, we'd each get $1.6 million, plus I'd get the house, which was worth another $800,000. She'd still walk away with enough to live comfortably if she was smart about it, which, knowing Melissa's future from my first life, she wouldn't be. "This is extortion," her lawyer said sharply. "This is justice," I corrected. "Your client committed elder abuse. I'm being generous by settling it all instead of pursuing criminal charges." That was a bluff. Criminal charges would be hard to make stick, but Melissa didn't know that. I watched fear flash across her face. After a brief, heated consultation with her lawyer, Melissa agreed. We drew up the settlement papers that afternoon. She signed the statement admitting to undue influence, though her hand shook with rage as she did it. The estate would be divided equally, I'd get the house, and we'd both walk away. "I hope you're happy," Melissa spat at me as we left the mediation. "You destroyed our family over money." I looked at her for a long moment. "Melissa, there was never a family to destroy. There was just you and Dad taking everything while I got nothing. I'm not destroying anything. I'm finally taking what I deserved all along." "You're heartless." "No," I said softly. "I'm just done being a victim." I walked away from her for the last time. We'd have no further contact. The estate lawyers would handle everything. I never saw Melissa again after that day, though I heard about her through the social media accounts I occasionally checked. True to form, she burned through her inheritance within 3 years on bad investments and expensive lifestyle choices. She'd marry again, divorce again, spiral into depression and debt. In some ways, her life would follow the same trajectory it had in my first timeline, just accelerated. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall. I felt nothing about her at all anymore. She was irrelevant. The house sold for $850,000. I didn't keep it, too many bad memories, and I didn't need it. Combined with my settlement from the estate, I had about $2.5 million in new capital to deploy. Added to my existing portfolio, I was now worth approximately $7 million at age 25. But the money was never really the point. The point was proving to myself that I could rewrite the story, that I wasn't doomed to repeat the suffering of my first life. The point was justice. Not revenge exactly, but the satisfaction of ensuring that Melissa didn't get to coast on Daddy's money after years of cruelty, and that Dad's final act wasn't one more rejection of his daughter. I invested the settlement proceeds carefully. More real estate, more strategic positions in companies I knew would soar. By 2017, my portfolio had grown to $15 million. I'd become a known figure in certain investment circles, the young woman who'd called the recession, who had an uncanny knack for picking winners, who'd built wealth from almost nothing. Mrs. Chen and I still had lunch quarterly. She was retired now, spending her time gardening and traveling, but she remained fascinated by my success. "You know what I think?" she said over tea at her favorite dim sum restaurant. "I think you've always had a gift for seeing what others miss. Even in high school, you understood people's motivations, could predict how situations would unfold. You applied that to markets and it made you wealthy, but the real skill isn't the money, it's the clarity." She was more right than she knew. My gift wasn't supernatural, it was just the profound advantage of having lived through these exact circumstances before. But clarity was the right word for it. I saw people and situations with ruthless accuracy because I'd already watched them play out once. "I had a good teacher," I said, raising my teacup to her. "You took a chance on a 16-year-old with a folder full of research and $4,000. You gave me the tools to build a different life." "You built it yourself," she said firmly. "I just co-signed some papers. Everything else, the research, the courage, the discipline, that was all you." I thought about correcting her, about explaining that I'd had the ultimate cheat code, but what would be the point? Even with foreknowledge, I'd still had to execute. I'd still had to work 3 jobs, live cheaply, stay focused while everyone else my age was partying. I'd still had to make the hard choice to cut out my father, to reject the fantasy of family reconciliation for the reality of self-preservation. "Thank you," I said simply, "for everything." By 2020, I'd pivoted my investment strategy. I knew the pandemic was coming. I'd lived through it once, watching helplessly as my retail job disappeared and I'd struggled to pay rent. This time, I was ready. In January 2020, I began liquidating positions and buying puts on travel, hospitality, and retail stocks. I moved heavily into tech companies that would benefit from remote work, streaming services, home fitness equipment. I bought Zoom, Peloton, Netflix. When the market crashed in March, I bought aggressively, all the blue chip stocks at bargain prices. My portfolio doubled to $30 million a single year. I used some of that wealth to start a foundation, the kind of charitable work I'd always wanted to do but never had resources for in my first life. I funded scholarships for students from abusive homes, grants for kids aging out of foster care, mental health services for young people. I did it all anonymously, through layers of legal structures, because I didn't want recognition. I wanted impact. I also hired a team, a lawyer, an accountant, a portfolio manager to handle the day-to-day trading under my strategic direction. I bought a penthouse in Manhattan with views of Central Park, a beach house in Malibu, a cabin in Montana for when I needed silence. I traveled Paris, Tokyo, Sydney, all the places I'd dreamed about in my first life, but never had money to visit. I dated occasionally, but never seriously. The men I met were either intimidated by my wealth and success or too interested in it. I didn't trust easily, and I didn't need a relationship to feel complete. Maybe someday I'd find someone who saw me as an equal, someone whose presence added to my life instead of draining it. But I wasn't searching. I was content. On my 30th birthday in 2022, I stood on my penthouse balcony watching the sunset paint the sky purple and gold. I was worth $50 million. I had homes across the country, a thriving foundation, investments in dozens of companies. I had freedom, security, and peace. In my first life, I'd been working retail at 30, living with roommates I hated, drowning in debt and depression. I'd been so broken by my family's rejection that I couldn't build anything stable. Every relationship failed because I was desperate for love. Every job ended badly because I had no confidence. I'd spiraled downward for 5 more years until the sleeping pills and the studio apartment and the final realization that no one would miss me. This life was different in every possible way. My phone rang, an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Is this Sophia Chen? A woman's voice, professional and cautious. Yes, who's this? My name is Jennifer Bradley. I'm a social worker with Child Protective Services in Connecticut. I'm calling about your stepsister, Melissa Davis. My stomach tightened. What about her? Ms. Davis has 2 children who've been removed from her custody due to neglect and substance abuse. We're trying to locate family members who might be willing to take temporary custody while she completes treatment. Your name came up as her only living relative. I closed my eyes. In my first life, I'd never known Melissa had kids. We'd been completely estranged by then. This was new information, a ripple effect from the timeline changing. What are their ages? 7 and 5. Girls, Emma and Lily. 2 little girls living with an addict who'd inherited all our father's worst traits. 2 little girls who were probably being scapegoated and neglected the way I had been. What happens if no family member steps up? They'll go into foster care. We'll try to keep them together, but there are no guarantees. I should have said no. I should have let them go into the system. It wasn't my problem, wasn't my responsibility. Melissa had made her choices. Why should I pay for them? But I thought about 7-year-old me, desperate for someone to care, for someone to see that what was happening wasn't okay. I thought about those 2 little girls who hadn't asked to be born to a mother like Melissa. I'll take them, I heard myself say. Temporarily while Melissa gets treatment. I'll need to be vetted, background checks, home studies, whatever you need. Jennifer's relief was audible. Thank you, Ms. Chen. Thank you so much. I'll start the paperwork immediately. Emma and Lily arrived 2 weeks later, brought by Jennifer and a police escort. They were small, too thin, with the wary eyes of children who'd learned not to trust adults. Emma, the older one, held Lily's hand tightly and glared at me with suspicion. Are you our aunt? She demanded. Sort of, I said, kneeling down to their eye level. Your mom and I are stepsisters. I know this is scary and confusing, but you're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you. That's what the last place said, Emma muttered. I learned quickly that Melissa had left them alone for days at a time, that there often wasn't food in the house, that utilities got shut off regularly. Emma had been trying to parent her little sister at 7 years old the way I'd tried to parent myself. I hired a nanny, a gentle Jamaican woman named Grace who had experience with traumatized children. I enrolled them in a good private school. I took them to a child psychologist. I bought them clothes, toys, books, things I'd craved as a child and never received. At night, Lily had nightmares and crawled into my bed. I'd hold her, stroke her hair, and whisper that she was safe now. Emma was harder. She stayed angry and defensive for months, testing boundaries, expecting me to give up on them. I didn't give up. Melissa completed a 30-day treatment program, then relapsed immediately. She went back for 90 days, then relapsed again. The custody arrangement kept extending. 3 months became 6, became a year. The social worker suggested I consider adopting them. Melissa's prognosis isn't good, Jennifer said gently during a review meeting. She's had 4 relapses in 18 months. And honestly, the girls are thriving with you. They're healthy, they're in therapy, they're excelling at school. Emma told me last week that she feels safe for the first time she can remember. I looked at the photos on my phone. Emma laughing as we baked cookies, Lily showing me her straight A report card, both of them asleep on the couch during movie night, finally looking peaceful. I'll adopt them, I said, if Melissa will agree to terminate her parental rights. Melissa fought it initially, from pride more than actual desire to parent. But her lawyer explained the reality. She'd have to complete treatment, maintain sobriety for 2 years, get stable housing and employment, pass regular drug tests and home visits. Or she could sign the papers and know her daughters were cared for. She signed. We never spoke directly. The lawyer handled everything. In 2024, Emma and Lily became legally mine. We had a small celebration, just us and Grace and Mrs. Chen, who'd become an honorary grandmother to the girls. Emma had started smiling more, even laughing. Lily was seeing her nightmares decrease in therapy. They called me Aunt Sophie and were starting to thrive. I'd never planned to be a mother. In my first life, I died childless and alone, convinced I'd be a terrible parent because of my own damaged childhood. But here I was raising two little girls who needed exactly what I'd needed at their age: safety, consistency, and someone who chose them first. The irony wasn't lost on me. Melissa's children had saved her children. I'd broken the cycle that damaged both of us. By 2025, my current present, Emma was 9 and Lily was 7. Emma wanted to be a scientist. Lily wanted to be a dancer. They fought over the bathroom and squabbled about TV time like normal kids. They also clung to routines, needed lots of reassurance, and occasionally had bad days where the trauma resurfaced. But they were healing. We all were. My portfolio had grown to $75 million through a combination of smart investments and some particularly good calls on emerging technologies. I'd pulled back from active trading to focus on the girls, hiring a team to manage most of my holdings. I still consulted on major decisions, but I wasn't obsessively tracking markets anymore. The foundation had given away over $10 million in scholarships and grants. Hundreds of kids from bad situations had gotten chances they wouldn't have had otherwise. I received letters sometimes from scholarship recipients telling me how much the money had changed their lives. I kept them all in a box in my office. Mrs. Chen came for dinner once a month, always bringing some treat for the girls. She was in her 70s now, starting to slow down but still sharp as ever. "You know what you've done?" she asked me one evening while the girls were doing homework. "You've taken every terrible thing that happened to you and turned it into fuel for creating something better. Not just the money. Anyone can make money. You've created a life with meaning, with purpose. You've raised children with love. You've helped hundreds of other kids escape situations like yours. That's rare, Sophia. That's special." "I just did what I had to do to survive," I said. "No," she corrected gently. "You did much more than survive. You transformed. And you helped others transform too." That night, after the girls were asleep and their apartment was quiet, I stood at my penthouse window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Melissa was probably still struggling, probably still blaming me for her problems instead of taking responsibility for her choices. I didn't hate her anymore. I barely thought about her except when the girls asked questions about their mother. And Dad? He'd been gone 10 years now. I'd made peace with his memory, or at least with the reality of who he'd been. A weak man who chose the easiest path, who couldn't handle the responsibility of a grieving daughter, who let alcohol and cowardice rule his decisions. He'd done damage, real damage that I'd carried for decades in my first life. But in this life, I'd chosen differently. I'd refused to let his failures define me. The prom night that started it all felt like ancient history. That scared 16-year-old girl waiting in the parking lot, still hoping her father would show up, still believing she needed his approval to matter, she was a stranger to me now. I'd taken that moment of absolute abandonment and used it as a catalyst for complete transformation. He'd forgotten to pick me up from prom. After Rebirth, I never answered his calls again. And that choice, that boundary, that refusal to keep accepting crumbs had saved my life. Not just metaphorically. In my first life, I'd killed myself at 35. In this life, I was 35 and thriving, raising two beautiful girls, running a foundation that changed lives, financially secure beyond my wildest dreams. I'd won. Not because I'd gotten revenge, though the estate settlement had been satisfying. I'd won because I'd built a life where their rejection didn't matter, where their approval was irrelevant, where I'd found my own worth independent of anyone else's recognition. That was the real victory. Not the money, not the success, not even the justice of the estate case. The victory was in becoming someone who didn't need any of it, who could stand alone and be complete. My phone buzzed, a goodnight text from Grace, who'd become family to us. Then another notification, an email from the foundation about a scholarship recipient who'd just gotten into medical school. I smiled, making a mental note to send a congratulatory card. Emma patted out in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Aunt Sophie? I had a bad dream." "Come here, baby." I held out my arms and she curled into me on the couch, still small enough to fit perfectly against my side. "You're safe. I've got you." "I know," she murmured, already drifting back to sleep. "You always do." Those 3 words meant more than every dollar in my portfolio, more than every investment that had paid off, more than the Manhattan skyline glittering before us. Because they meant I'd broken the cycle. I'd taken the abandonment and neglect that had nearly destroyed me and transformed it into presence and protection for these children who needed it. Dad had forgotten to pick me up. He'd forgotten so many things, missed so many moments, broken so many promises. After Rebirth, I'd stopped answering his calls, stopped begging for his love, stopped believing I needed his approval to be worthy. And in that refusal, in that boundary, in that choice to stop participating in my own diminishment, I'd found everything I'd ever needed. Not from him, not from Melissa, not from anyone else. From myself. I'd saved myself. I'd rebuilt myself. I'd become the parent I'd needed, the protector I'd wished for, the success story that seemed impossible from that parking lot at 17. The girl who'd waited alone after prom would barely recognize the woman I'd become. And that was exactly the point. I carried Emma back to bed, tucked her in, kissed her forehead. Sweet dreams, Em. Sweet dreams, Aunt Sophie. Love you. Love you too, sweetheart. I checked on Lily, still sleeping soundly, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Then I returned to my room, my sanctuary, my castle, built from determination and refusal to be broken. In my first life, I'd ended in darkness, believing I was unworthy of love or success. In this life, I'd built an empire of light. That was my victory. That was my revenge, not against them, but against the lie that I was worthless, against the story that victims stay victims, against the idea that damage is permanent. I'd rewritten every word. I'd reclaimed every moment. I'd transformed every wound into wisdom and every betrayal into strength. And I'd done it by making one simple choice at 17, to stop waiting for someone else to save me and save myself instead. He forgot to pick me up from prom. After Rebirth, I never answered his calls again. And that was how I won.